This is the second reading guide for Wednesday, January 21st. The second reading guide for Wednesday, January 21st. This will cover Chapter 2 and then also the Darwin-Wallace paper. This chapter should largely be a review, and I think you've already gone through it, but I just want to emphasize the parts that I think are important to give you a little idea of what to focus on for the quiz on Wednesday. In particular, I think I mentioned this in class, I will not ask you for names or dates of particular scientists. I'm going to focus a lot more on the particular concepts than who and when. In the beginning, of course, I always want you to look at the learning objectives. I'm going to point out they talk about the role of fossil record playing in the development of the concept of evolution. That I think is important. You want to be able to explain the difference between homologous and analogous traits here, and then identify 3 modes of evolution, and we'll get into what those modes are as we progress in the semester, but we need to know what they are starting now. Okay, there is a sentence on this page here that says that it'd be a mistake to reduce evolutionary biology to Darwin alone. That's somewhere around here. And that comes up with those misconceptions. So this is, repeating that importance of Darwin, but not being limited just to Darwin. We have a couple of terms over here, taxon and taxonomy. You should be familiar with those already. Just pointing them out in case you've missed them somehow. Okay, and at this point you're going to start largely skimming. Nature before Darwin, we're back in time here, evolution before Darwin. You're still kind of skimming here because this is all stuff that you covered with Brent in greater detail. I'm going to keep scrolling. I want to point out box 2.1. I think this is an excellent box, and this takes Lamarck into a slightly greater depth here. So I want you to figure out what is the difference between Lamarckian inheritance and Lamarckian evolution. Which one of those do we have evidence of, and what is that evidence? I think that's a great quiz question there. On the next page, there is a comment about uniformitarianism. Why is that important to evolution? And this, I believe, is something that Brent covered as well. We've got another box coming up, this theories in science. If you are not familiar with the difference between a theory and a hypothesis in science, these are not the same terms in science as they are in common parlance, so you want to be clear on what makes a theory versus a hypothesis. And then here's a figure that I want you to pay close attention to, figure 2.15, and I'm going to have you come back to this as you get a little further in the chapter as well. In this, the first 3 facts up here are facts from population ecology, these 3 up here. And then when you get down here, these are facts about inheritance. And then there are a couple of inferences. I want you to know this diagram inside and out. We will build on this for the entire semester. This is I've got lots of great questions on this here. I also want to point out that there's a comment about what is random. In your misconceptions, you have a question about how much of evolution is random. So here's something talking about something being random or not random. So make sure you add this to your evidence when you're thinking about misconceptions. Okay, there are a few more terms coming up, homologous and analogous. These should be very familiar from biodiversity, but if they are not familiar, make sure you double check that you know what they are. I'll be using these terms. And here's a sample where I might use these terms. Are lungs and gills homologous or analogous traits? They talk quite a bit about this in here, so be able to answer that kind of question. Okay, we're getting to the end of the chapter here. Oops. Second, wrong button. Okay. Now this is the part where I'm going to have you go back to that figure 2.15. And in that figure, I want you to go back and, after you've read about Malthus, what parts of that figure are direct influence of Malthus' ideas? So back here on that cool figure, facts are some of the facts or the inferences, a direct result of Malthus and Malthus' ideas. And then down here we have what is similar and different about artificial and natural selection. I start getting into some of that here. So I want you to know those differences. More terms, sexual selection, adaptations here on the sides. And then remember that you're always taking note of anything that talks about chance, randomness, right? Because this has to do with our misconceptions. We've got genetic drift over here, which will comment on chance and randomness. In the summing up down here, not much of that is really very deep, but homology is on there, which is important. A lot of this is about, particular people and what they said, and I'm not too worried about that. I'm going to point out the multiple choice questions that I think are relevant. Question 1 looks like a good one. Question 4 looks good. 5 is another way of testing yourself. And then short answer, basically everything on this side over here. These are all questions that I came up with as I was reading through. Well, most of them are. So these are good ones to think through answers to this, because these are the types of questions I'll be asking you on the quiz. Okay, so we're going to move right ahead. After you've read that, then I want you to go in and read, and actually I'm going to open it up here. So here we have the Darwin Wallace paper online, and actually what I did is copied it over into a Word document so I could make some comments as I went through. So I'm going to move to that, but it's just a direct copy of this webpage, which is linked on our Moodle site. Okay, so as we go through this, a couple of things I want to point out here. So what are the two conclusions from the observation that wild populations do not increase exponentially? Two conclusions from the observation that wild populations do not increase exponentially. Okay. We've highlighted a passage here about recurrent struggles against other species and external nature. So what is it that limits resources that in turn limit population sizes? Keep going down. What is the difference between sexual and natural selection according to Darwin? Right, and we talked about the difference between artificial and natural selection from chapter 2. Now I want you to think about the difference between sexual and natural selection according to Darwin. And then I also want you to make some notes about how he uses artificial selection to further his argument. In fact, both Darwin and Wallace talk about artificial selection quite a bit. I've highlighted a passage here about selection acts only by the accumulation of slight or greater variations caused by external conditions, and the mere fact that in generation the child is not absolutely similar to its parent, right? We're talking about mutation and change over generations. I made a comment here. I really like this phrase. Only a few of those annually born can live to propagate their kind. What a trifling difference must often determine which shall survive and which perish. Now, the writing of Darwin is really very powerful. Okay, moving down there, I just wanted to give you a little background. So one of the things I like to do in these reading guides is to give you background on something you may not have seen before, a phrase you may not know, a vocabulary term. If they come across a method you haven't seen before, I'll explain that in the reading guides. Here, my guess is that you have not maybe run across this natura non facit saltum. Sorry for the pronunciation, but that's a Latin phrase that means that nature does not make jumps. And as I did, you can Google this. But basically, the idea that this is getting to is that species develop from earlier species through gradual and minute changes, not through sudden emergence of brand new forms. Jumps can occur, but they occur on a sort of a smaller biological scale, not where you see an entirely new species coming about in a single generation, for instance. So that knowing that should help you make more sense of this, that portion of the reading. Okay, we're getting into here. Now we're on to where Wallace starts talking. Okay, so this is Wallace's paper. Um, does Wallace think that fecundity plays an important part in determining the abundance of species? Why or why not? What examples is he using? Be prepared to use those examples to explain this form of thinking. Abundance and fertility and predation. You want to know how these things all interact. What is the most important condition for ensuring the rapid increase of a given species? Darwin and Wallace will both talk about different things that affect the stability of populations or the increase of populations. What are all of those things? And then what's the most important of those? Um, Darwin and Wallace both talk about trophic levels as evidence for their proposed mechanism of evolution. How do they use trophic levels as evidence? And know that. That's a great question there. Um, here, here Wallace has 2 points, and you will discover through the course of the semester. I like lists. I like bulleted lists. I like numbers. So I will always point those out to you guys. So what leads to a stationary population size? I've basically asked you this in a bunch of different ways before. What causes the abundance and scarcity of different species? And you're going to be able to identify the most important of those factors. As we keep going down, what is the evidence that domestic varieties, when they're turned wild, must return to something near the type of the original wild stock or become altogether extinct? I mean, he talks a lot about this domestic turning wild kind of stuff. So basically, if you can answer this one question, what's the evidence that domestic varieties, when turned wild, um, must return to something near the type of the original wild stock or become altogether extinct? That's enough. Don't worry about the excessive detail that he goes into. Okay, so I think you've got a little better focus on what is important out of these readings. I generally will not ask you something on a quiz that I have not pointed out in a reading. So when I say be able to answer this question, I mean it. That is likely a question on the quiz. And I'll give you, 5 to 10 of those per reading. And if you have, say, at this point we have 4 readings, right? That's 40 potential questions. We will have anywhere from 10 to 15 questions. So not everything I say is going to be a question on there, is actually going to make the final cut. But all of those things are potential for the quiz. And as we go through the semester, I'll do more paring down of the things I ask you to focus on. But at this point, I want to make sure that we're all on the same page. You all have the same background. So I'm getting you quite a bit of reading, although it's very easy reading, just to make sure we're all there. And we will pare down quite a bit as we move through the semester. So I will see you in class on Wednesday. Be sure to drop me an email if you're having trouble answering any of those questions. Confer with the rest of your classmates. Send me an email, but make sure that you are coming into class with those questions written out and answered. You want to be prepared in that way. All right, enjoy.